Hello, and welcome to the Banff at Altitude podcast, celebrating 50 years of adventure storytelling from the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival. Since its beginning in 1976, the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival has been a gathering place in celebration of all things mountain culture. The yearly festival, hosted at Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, fosters an appreciation of the world's mountain places by creating opportunities for people to share and find inspiration in mountain experiences, ideas, and visions. Over the years, we've spoken to hundreds of incredible adventurers who share their spectacular and moving stories. My name is Joanna Croston, and I'm going to be digging through our festival archives to revive some of our favorite presentations from the past to get you stoked for what's to come in 2025, our 50th anniversary. And well, hopefully you'll be stoked for life in general. In continuing with this tradition of sharing stories and connections, we hope this podcast will inspire you to explore, preserve, and enjoy the great outdoors. For J.R. Harris, his real adventures in life began in 1966, when as a young New Yorker, he impulsively drove his VW Beetle across the country to the very end of the northernmost road in Alaska. He was searching for an answer to a simple question. What is it like to be way out there? Harris is the author of Way Out There, an account of his extraordinary exploits while backpacking in some of the world's most tantalizing places, largely alone and unsupported. After almost 50 years of wilderness travel, J.R., as he's known, has plenty of tales to tell. His stories are funny, tragic, and uplifting, and all are told in his down-to-earth, friendly style. From the Banff stage at the 2018 festival, here is author and adventurer J.R. Harris.
Wow. I have to start off by telling you how excited I am to be here. This is the first time I've been out to the festival. I get to see and hear so many great climbers, so many award-winning authors telling their stories. It's so great. The people have been fabulous. The staff here, so nice. Everybody's so friendly and approachable. And so I just wanted to tell you what a great moment this is for me to be here. And I want to thank all of you for coming out to hear my stories tonight. Thanks a lot. So, wow. I think I'll quit now. My talk is called Trail Talk from an Old Dirt Kicker. And so before I go any further, I just want to clarify that topic. I'm not saying that I'm the one that's old. It's the dirt that's old, okay? So it's trail talk from an old dirt kicker. I kick old dirt. Just saying, okay? So now, I've been kicking this trail dirt for many years, over half a century. And during all that time, a lot of people have been curious about what it's like to travel in the wilderness. So for my talk tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 10 issues or questions that people have been most curious about. And for each one, I'm going to take you on a little trip around the world on a journey that I've taken where that particular issue or question is relevant. And I'll say a few words about each of the 10. Then after that, I'm going to summarize it by just giving you a brief list of the 5 things that I've kind of learned over all that time. I probably should mention that I wrote a book, 9 chapters, based on detailed journals that I've kept over all these years, in addition to all my maps, photos, correspondence. I arranged them chronologically, starting in 1966, before there was internet and GPS and all that. So even though each of these chapters is a story unto itself, as you read them from one to the other, you begin to see, for example, how technology has come into backpacking, how the ethic of backpacking has evolved, things like ultralight, leave no trace. And you also get to see how me as a person evolved over all that time, both as a trekker and just as a person. The book has black and white and color photos. There's a little map in front of each chapter to help you follow the action. If you're looking for something decent to read and you can't find anything, try to read this book here. You might like it. So let's lace them up and kick some dirt. First thing that people ask me, and the thing I get asked most often is, why do you do this? I live in New York City. It comes out usually more like, what are you, crazy? What's wrong with you? You know, you're out there, you're sleeping on the ground, you're carrying a pack. You call that a trip? You call it vacation? Well, there are a lot of reasons why I do it. I like the adventure of it, the excitement. I like to put myself in different situations, different environments, see how I react. But the biggest reason why I do it is because I'm curious. And I'm especially curious about the natural world. All of my trips have a curiosity component. I believe that curiosity is the engine that drives exploration. Explorations that need to get out there, to see it for myself, to be there in person, and to really experience it firsthand. And of all the things I'm curious about, one of the most things I'm curious about are people who live in remote areas. I'm a social scientist by education. I have a degree in psychology. And I'm able to now combine it, my curiosity about people, with trekking. And so in 2012, I went to Peru. So I was interested in the Inca. When people think about the Inca, they generally think about Machu Picchu. But I wasn't really that interested in deserted buildings. I was more interested in the descendants of the Inca. I was told that if you go back far enough in the Andes, you can find people who are still living the same way they were living hundreds of years ago. People still wearing the same traditional clothing, still speaking Quechua, the original language that doesn't even have a written version to it. And so I said, yeah, I got to go out there and check that out. So I first went to Cusco to acclimatize, stayed there 4 or 5 days. Cusco is a little bit over 11,000 feet. And while I was there, I happened to see this parade one Sunday morning when people got dressed up in their native costumes and they came out. It was less of a parade than kind of a social gathering. They paraded for about 100 meters, and then they said, you know what, forget about it. Then they started talking to each other and having a good time. They're playing their instruments. And it was kind of a nice introduction to this lifestyle in this part of the world. Then I took a bus for hours into the mountains and then walked from there for another long time. And I got here. This is the Ausangate Mountain. It's one of 22 sacred mountains, sacred to the Inca. And this one is the most sacred. And so I was told that if you walk around it, there are people behind that mountain that were still living this ancient lifestyle. And so that's what I did. I walked around it counterclockwise. And this is an example of the little communities where they live. It's usually about 4 or 5 families, maybe 15, 20, 25 people. The houses are made of sod. There's usually only one window. It's quite cold up here, and so they don't want too much draft and too much ventilation. Obviously, there's no indoor plumbing here, and the roof is thatched. They're herding llamas and alpacas, sometimes in these stone corrals. At other times, they're free range, just out on the mountains. They were still speaking Quechua, as I mentioned before. I speak a little Spanish. I grew up in New York City. You got to speak Spanish there. So I was able to communicate. And then I got lucky. I made a campsite, and these 4 guys came riding up on horseback, and they made a camp not far from where I was. And they were really curious about me. They were like, who is this dude by himself? He's got no horse. He's got nothing. He's got his one little tent. And they couldn't really resist it anymore. And so they came over and they said, what are you doing here? Turned out that this gentleman here is a shaman, and the other 3 were his acolytes. And they told me that they had come up there to make an offering to the sacred mountain on behalf of somebody who wanted to have a child. And when I told them that I was there because I was interested in their culture and their history and their tradition, and that I had studied a lot before I left home, but I just wanted to see for myself how they lived, he invited me to come in and partake or witness the ceremony that very few outsiders had ever seen before. It's at night. It was about 8 o'clock at night when it started. Before he actually started, we were chewing on these cocoa leaves for about an hour. Things started to get a little fuzzy. But hey, it was part of the ceremony. Now, he's making an offering here to the Pachamama, the female goddess, one of the deities in their religion. Pachamama likes sweets, so there are a lot of candies and cookies and things like that. For each one, he would do different incantations. He would dip it in some of these liquids, placing it very precisely on this offering here. And then when he was finished, he folded it up, and he told his two acolytes there to go outside, and they made a fire. Then we went outside, and he laid it on the fire. Now, we weren't allowed to watch him put it actually on the fire. He made us turn our back. But when he put it on, we were allowed to turn around, and he was watching it very, very intensely for about 15, 20 minutes or so, and then he was convinced that the mountain gods had accepted the offering and the ceremony was over. So it's all about curiosity, and I'd like to read you a little excerpt from the book where I talk about curiosity. A curious mind can never rest. There are too many issues to learn, too many things to see and do, too many questions that need answers. And the answers only beget more questions, so the curious mind is always restless and can never be satisfied. If you let your body follow, a curious mind will lead you down paths never anticipated. What you end up with is a life of incessant exploration and discovery. This can be frustrating because true curiosity never achieves closure. Or it can be fulfilling for exactly the same reason. A curious mind may never be satisfied, but if you remain inquisitive, it will always be gratified. So people say, well, what skills do you need to get out there in the wilderness? So to talk about skills, I'm going to take you to Newfoundland, to Grossmore National Park. Now, my French isn't that great, but to me, gross means fat or big, and morn means dismal, dreary, like that. So this is like the big, dismal national park. I don't understand why anybody would name a national park like that. And I want to read you a brief statement on the brochure for this national park, talking about the long-range mountains, the biggest feature in the park. And it says, the long-range mountains provide hikers with some of the most scenic and challenging hiking terrain in eastern North America. Hiking the long-range mountains is physically and mentally challenging. It is remote, strenuous, and potentially hazardous. There are no built trails on the Long Range, although there are a number of suggested backcountry routes. These routes are not marked with signs or maintained in any manner. Hikers need backcountry travel experience, be self-reliant, and proficient using maps and compass to navigate unfamiliar wilderness terrain. Who would want to go there? I mean, how is that, enticing people to go here? Well, they got me, okay? And the reason I picked this for skills is because in all the trips I've ever done, this is the only place I ever went where you had to pass a skill test before you could go into the backcountry. You had to prove to the rangers that you were proficient with a map and a compass. Now, also when I went there, a backcountry permit was about $125. And they made you buy the permit before they gave you the test. And if you didn't pass the test, you lose your money. I don't see how a national park can do that. So, all right, I had no problem. I knew I wasn't going to have a problem passing my test because I've been doing it for so many years. So anyway, just to talk about skills for 1 second, here's why it's tough in this national park to get around. The vegetation here is so thick. They call this tuckamore. And you could walk into this heading north, but by the time you work your way through it all, when you get outside the other way, you don't know if you're facing north, south, east, or west, or if you actually turned around and facing back in the direction that you came in. There are some game trails that go through here, but you don't know if the game is going in the direction that you want to go in. So it's really very complicated, and I could see why they actually have this requirement here. So if you get above the tree line here, it becomes a little easier. You can actually climb all the way up to the top, which I did on that day, but things got worse right away after that because I dropped my compass and stepped on it and it broke. So I knew there was no way I could get to my destination without a compass, and I was really not that sure I could get back the way I came because it was so complicated. And so what I ended up doing is I devised this plan where I said, now, if I can get to this big lake way in the back here, and that lake is running east and west, and it's a pretty long lake. So I decided to try to make it to that lake as long as I hit the lake somewhere, and then when I got to the lake, I could turn right heading west, and if I kept going in that direction, sooner or later, I would get to the coast, and the coast was pretty close to where I started. So that's a little vague, but that was the best I had at the time. And so it took me several days to do it, but in the end, I finally got out. So skills, it's about confidence, it's about knowing what you're doing, and if you ever want to go to Grossmoor, let me know how it, how it works out for you. So let's talk about planning. Whenever I think about planning, I think about this kind of old school American founding father, a guy named Benjamin Franklin. And what I like about Benjamin Franklin is he could tell it like it is. He didn't waste a whole lot of words. He could get it down like to one sentence. You know, he said stuff like, well done is better than well said. Time waits for no one. You know, if Benjamin Franklin was alive today, he'd probably be the first person to say, it is what it is, you know? But one thing that Franklin said, he said, failing to plan is like planning to fail. And that really struck home with me because planning is probably the most important determinant as to whether or not your trip is going to be successful. The better you plan it, the more likely it is that you'll be in good shape and you'll do all right. And so back in 1986 here, I went up to the gates of the Arctic National Park on a trip that was fairly complicated to plan. The trip was 23 days long. I would have to go from New York to an Inuit village, Anaktuvik Pass, some of you may have been there, and then I was going to walk about a week across the tundra until I got to a lake, and then I had to arrange for a bush pilot to bring in a canoe and 10 more days' worth of food, and then drag the canoe into the river adjacent to it, the John River, and then float down the river for another 10 days to a little town of Bettles. And so I went with a friend of mine, and we had to do all the planning on ourselves. So I want to just read to you what it took back in 1986 to plan a trip on your own. If we were planning this trip accompanied by a local outfitter with experience in that environment, all the planning would be taken care of. We'd be given a list of what to bring, advice on what to expect, and we would not have to deal with the complex logistics. Doing it independently meant assuming all the risks, which emphasized the importance of careful, detailed preparation. Our planning began more than 6 months before the departure date. In that largely pre-internet era, we typed and sent snail mail letters to the National Park Service and to anyone else who might have information about northern Alaska. There were books to read about the Arctic and the Brooks Range. There were indigenous people to learn about as well, the Nunamiut or Inupiat Eskimos in the northern part of the Brooks Range, and the Athabascan Indians who inhabited the southern regions. We researched and charted weather trends, made estimates of daily time and travel distances, got information about airline schedules, lodging, charter flights, canoe rentals, made lists of food and gear requirements, evaluated warmth to weight ratios for different articles of clothing, and estimated budgets. We learned about the area's flora and fauna, including how to travel safely in grizzly country. We discussed various emergency scenarios and how we would deal with them. We gathered information about the wilderness first aid, put together a comprehensive first aid kit. I ordered topographic maps from the US Geological Survey and waited impatiently for them to return by snail mail. Nowadays, you punch in on your computer and they download it right away. We purchased a lightweight 12-gauge shotgun and went to a gun club every week to learn gun safety and practice shooting. Bear spray, a must-have in today's safe travel in grizzly country, was not available back then. Also not available were bear-proof food containers or cell phones. Once we left our point of departure, we would have no method of communication and would be totally out of touch with the rest of the world. Our planning took nothing for granted. In January of 1986, 6 months before we departed, a malfunction of a simple O-ring destroyed the Space Shuttle Challenger. And just 6 months later, a mishandled safety test resulted in a nuclear disaster in Chernobyl. The impact of these tragic events was not lost on us, to say the least. Everything worked out really well on this trip. The coolest thing about this trip for me in planning was in the Brooks Range, there was a tradition that if you made the first ascent of a mountain, you got to name it. And that tradition was started by Bob Marshall, who was an early Arctic explorer, especially in the Brooks Range. And most of the mountains there that had a name, he gave them the name. He was the first one to climb them. And so I knew that there was this unclimbed mountain that was going to be right there on the John River. And I determined that I would try to make a camp there and climb it, which I did, right where the 60-mile creek comes in off to the right-hand side. And I climbed it, and I named it after my younger brother, who I was very close to, so now it's called Lloyd Mountain. When I got to the top, I took out my little broken bow of wilderness patches that I have, and I took a business card, and on the back of the card, I wrote the date and the time and the name that I wanted to name the mountain. I stuck them both in a Ziploc plastic bag, and I buried them under a pile of stones not far from the summit. So now, if you ever find yourself in the vicinity here, and you got yourself a little bit of time, and you want to take a climb, you may be just the second person that got up there. So, of course, when I got back to Bettles, the rangers were very nice. They took the information down. They told me that if they ever revised the topo map, that his name would be there. They also told me they're probably not going to revise it unless there's a hurricane or a tornado that changes the course of the river, and there's some reason why they have to do it. But it was still a thrill to do it. And I was still thrilled to be there. So, there's nothing like coming back from a trip where everything worked out the way you planned it. Planning is fun to do anyway on a trip, but when you do it right and everything works out great, there's no better feeling in the world. You're coming back safe and everything worked out well. So, fitness. How fit do you have to be? What do you have to do to stay in shape? I got to say, when I was 20, 30 years old, nobody ever asked me that. This question now only comes up these days, It's pretty obvious that if you go into the backcountry, you need to be fit. Although I met some people who say, well, I'm going to go in to get fit. When you come home, you're probably going to be fitter than when you left, but you're probably not going to have fun in the process. And for me, it's all about having fun. The fitter you are, the more fun you're going to have. So I could have picked any trip for fitness because fitness is so necessary on any trip, but I picked this trip here. 2014, I went to Norway, the Jotunheimen National Park, primarily because this particular trip was going to be a very rugged trip in terms of physical exertion. So I flew into Oslo, I took a bus north, and this is where the road ends. The bus then turns around and goes back. The thing about this is that as soon as you get off the bus and you start hiking, you're immediately going uphill. And you're going uphill, and you're going to keep on going uphill. Beautiful scenery. But another rugged trip, because I was carrying a lot of weight here, as I usually do, because I'm usually alone. And this is where I was going. This is a mountain called Glittertind. And this mountain is the second highest mountain in Norway. It's about 8,000 feet. I made a little campsite down in the valley, and the next day I walked up and down. The reason I picked this trip to talk about fitness was because it was 4 years ago, just after I turned 70. So that brings us to attitude. Here's the deal with attitude. In the urge to learn skills and perhaps to be fit, most people discount the importance of attitude. But I'm here to tell you that attitude is one of the most important aspects of a trip, because attitude can determine the success or failure of a trip, or even whether you come back home, to be totally blunt about it. You really have to keep it together. They say only the strong survive. But on a trip, in the wilderness, it's not necessarily the strongest person. It's the person who's able to keep it together when things go wrong. The person who knows that they have to just hang tough, and roll with it. It was certainly the case in Australia in 1997, in the mountains here. I went here with two friends of mine. This is the Australian Alps National Park. We had a guy drive us to the trailhead. It was 32 miles from the nearest town. He dropped us off, and then he went back, and then we started walking. We found out right away that we were in big trouble because we couldn't find any water. Now, we knew it had been dry, but we didn't know exactly how dry it had been, and we were quite surprised to find that most of the streams that were on the map were totally dry. Even the perennial streams that are there all the time, they were gone. And so right off the bat, we were in big trouble. We would hike all day and then make a camp, and then we'd have to split up and go in different directions and try to find water. Now, the problem, of course, is that if you don't have any water, obviously you have nothing to drink, but you also have nothing to eat because the food was freeze-dried and you need those 2 cups of boiling water to make that food come back alive. So it was really tough. This is a shot of the Australian Alps. You can see it's fairly steep, not too many trails. And lack of water is in addition to all the things that make things tough to hike in Australia anyway. There's 3 species of snakes. All of them are poisonous. They're biting ants, lizards. Even the plant life, everything seemed to have thorns and just really hostile. It was about 100 degrees, I guess 40 degrees, all day long, carrying heavy packs. And so what we had to do, the 3 of us were experienced, and at some point early on, we actually sat down and said, look, it's going to be tough. We have to hang tough together, and we have to maintain a good, positive attitude. So we resolved not to complain. We decided that no matter what happened, we wouldn't talk about it, we wouldn't complain, we didn't want to drag anybody else down, and we were just going to try to hold it together until we were able to get out. But we finished it off. We're still smiling, we're still friends. Everything worked out well in the end. I should mention, though, that just before this picture was taken, there was water at the end here, and each of us had just finished drinking about 10 liters of water. It's all about attitude. So that brings us to weather. Years ago, I was walking on the Continental Divide Trail in Colorado, and as I got to the tree line, there was a sign right next to the trail, and the headline on the sign said, "Nature doesn't care." And I was like, whoa. And so the sign went on to say that if you're reading this sign right now and the weather's looking a little sketchy, don't go any farther because you're about to go into above the tree line where it's dangerous. It can snow at any time of the year. There are whiteout conditions, afternoon thunderstorms, lightning. Weather doesn't care. And so that got me thinking, weather is essentially, to me, the great equalizer because weather doesn't care how rich or how poor you are. Weather doesn't care how important you are. Weather doesn't care if you're black, white, green, or orange. It doesn't care how much experience you have. Weather doesn't care if you got places to go, you have to be someplace at a certain time. Weather doesn't care. And I think there's kind of this lesson of humility there, that you don't really control everything. You kind of take it for granted at home. If it's cold, you turn the heater on. If it's warm, you turn the air conditioner on. If it's rainy, you go inside. But you really learn the impact of weather when you're out there. And so I went out to Iceland in 2005. Iceland is a volcanic island. The steam is coming up from everywhere. There are a lot of volcanoes there. You get the sense that there's a tremendous amount of heat energy right underneath your feet. But at the same time, some of these mountains have these big glaciers on top. And I was always curious, what happens when there's an eruption and all these millions of tons of ice melt? Where does all that water go? And what kind of devastation does it bring? I didn't want it to happen when I was there, but I wanted to go and see what it was like when it happened. It happened Back in the 1930s or somewhere thereabouts, there was a big eruption. It melted a gigantic glacier, and everything for 20 miles and several miles across, totally gone. And all these years later, it's still gone. And so it gives you a notion of how strong nature can be when something like this happens. And I was so curious about it. I'm glad I actually got up there. But right after that, the weather got bad. And then after it got bad, it got worse. And then after it got worse, it got worse. And so I get hit with a storm that is the worst storm I'd ever been in. And I've been doing this 50 some odd years. I've been in a lot of bad weather. But with this storm here, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't even stand up. It was cold, it was windy, it was really wicked. All I could do was set up my tent, stake it out as tight as I could, get inside, and just wait there. So when I got back to Reykjavik, I was talking to the guy at the hostel that I was staying in, and he said, "Hey, JR, how was your trip?" And I said, "Oh, it was really great. I got to see what I wanted to see, but man, about 5 or 6 days ago, I got hit with this wicked, wicked storm." And the guy said, "Oh, yeah, that was a Category 5 hurricane." What? Category 5 hurricane? He said it was a hurricane called Hurricane Katrina. And it was the hurricane that destroyed New Orleans. I said, "New Orleans is destroyed?" He goes, "Yeah, New Orleans is flooded. It's totally gone." And what happened was, after Katrina devastated New Orleans, it continued up the eastern seaboard, and then it veered back out into the North Atlantic, where it picked up strength again and became a Category 5 hurricane and slammed into Iceland just when I happened to be there. You know, I think the lesson for me is that weather really teaches you a lesson that not only applies to being in the wilderness, probably applies to being back home as well, that we as people don't control everything, and that there are forces greater than us. There's a lesson in humility that you can learn from the weather. I certainly did. So here we go, 7, wildlife. I like to see wildlife, as I'm sure a lot of you do when you go out. I believe that we live in a shared planet, and that seeing wildlife living the way that they should live naturally is actually a privilege, as far as I'm concerned. Years ago, I was actually again in Canada, up north in Canadian Rockies here. I was talking to this First Nations guy, and I was telling him how much I enjoy seeing wildlife when I trek. Doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you know, it's really gratifying for me to see it. And he says, "You want to see wildlife?" He said, "I'm going to tell you how to see wildlife, because you're from New York. You don't know anything about wildlife." He said, "I'm going to break it down in 3 words." He says, "Sit, watch, and learn." And he went on to explain that basically when you're walking through the wilderness, all the animals in the area, they're going to know that you're there or that you're coming. They're either going to see you, smell you, or hear you. And typically what happens is they're going to move away and let you walk through, and then after you get through, they're going to come back and they're going to do what they were doing before you got there. He said, but if you want to see the wildlife, find yourself a nice place to sit. Keep quiet, don't fidget around, just relax, be patient, and the animals will begin to understand that you are not a threat and that they can come back and do what they were doing without really worrying about you. And so if you're patient, you can do it. And sure enough, it works. Typically what happens is the first thing you see are the birds coming back. And then after you see the birds, you begin to see the small animals, the chipmunks, squirrels, marmots, whatever's out there. Maybe they're getting a tip from the birds that it's okay, so then they come out. And then if you're patient enough and quiet enough, you'll begin to see the big mammals come out, the deer, moose, caribou, bear, even wolves. And so sit, watch, and learn. It turned out to be a really good lesson for me. Over the years, I've been really lucky to see some wildlife up close. When you wake up in the morning and you see fresh grizzly tracks not too far from your campsite, and then you realize that you are not at the top of the food chain, that can be an eye-opener as well. If we give this wildlife their space, give them a little respect, we can all get along, we can share this planet. And it's probably good advice for humans as well. If we give each other some space, we can all kind of get along. Alone. I get this question a lot. People will say, well, why do you go by yourself? What's up with that? Some people say, I get it. I've done it. I like it. Most people say, it's crazy. You don't go out by yourself. Even people who have a lot of experience, people who have done it before, they've told me, I'm not going to go out alone. I want somebody else to be there, somebody to talk to, somebody to share my ideas with, or just somebody to be there. You know, going alone, it's just something that some people can't really understand. I actually like going alone. Also, living in New York, there's probably nobody you could get to go with you on these trips anyway. So you may as well get used to it. But I must say that the relatively few trips that I've taken with friends have all been great. They've only been about 7 or 8 people that I've ever gone out with over all these years, so most of the trips are alone. But I'm not antisocial, I'm not misanthropic, I'm not somebody who doesn't like people. It's just that I like to be alone. What I really like about being alone is kind of what I learned about myself, you know? It's a chance to be introspective, to see how you deal with unusual situations when there's nobody else there to give you any advice, where you have to have the courage of your convictions and trust your decision-making. And so here's a trip that I did, another Canadian trip, by the way, the Canal Trail. Most people have never heard of this route here, and it's now a National Heritage Trail of Canada. It's called Canal Heritage Trail, Northwest Territories. I did it in 1997, and the trail stretches from the border between the Yukon and Northwest Territories over the Mackenzie Mountains all the way to the Mackenzie River, where there was, back in World War II, some oil deposits there. What I wanted to do was to hike this trail. It's 30,000 square miles, totally uninhabited, and it's not a national park or any kind of government land, and so there's nobody patrolling it. There are no rangers and no aircraft flying overhead. It's 233 miles, and so I decided, yeah, I'll try it. The guy standing next to me, his name is Perry Linton. And back in 1997, he was the best Canadian bush pilot alive. And he told me that about 12 times. That's how I know. The plane that he's standing next to is called the Helio Courier, wide wings, Tundra tires. It's a short takeoff and landing plane. This plane can take off and land in any kind of terrain. And the idea was that we're in Norman Wells here on the Mackenzie River, and I chartered this plane to fly me up to the border of the Yukon and Northwest Territories, drop me off, and then I was going to walk the 233 miles back. As we were flying out, I had him land twice, and at each time he landed, I jumped out, and I left a week's supply of food. This is the landing strip at the border where I finally got out. Nobody is there. It's just scraped in the tundra. And I can tell you, when you see that plane take off, and there's nobody around, you know, for 50, 80 miles, that's when you know that you're really alone. But this was a beautiful trip. The landscape was really beautiful. It was in late summer. It was just turning with the foliage here on the tundra. Really spectacular mountain scenery here. It's still uninhabited up here, you know, after all these years. I walked on this trail 3 weeks. I never saw another hiker from start to finish. And then when I finally got back to Norman Wells, in those days it had a population of about 200 people. 80% were First Nations. And I noticed that the Canadian flag was at half-staff, and I assumed that some local dignitary had died, the mayor or the police chief or somebody. So I said, well, you know, who passed away? And the guy says to me, oh, that was Princess Diana from Britain. I said, what? He goes, oh, yeah, it was really a tragic incident. It was a car accident in Paris. There's extensive media coverage. There was the big funeral. Elton John wrote a song about it. Everybody was talking about it. I said, when did this happen? He said, oh, this happened about 2 weeks ago. I said, oh, wow. He said, yeah, I was surprised that the flag is still at half-staff because it's quite a while ago. Then he looked at me and he said, man, JR, with the media coverage that that funeral had, you're probably one of the few people on the planet who until this moment did not know that this had happened. Being alone and being isolated like that really puts you out of touch. I have something to say about alone in the book. Going solo is the ultimate detachment. It provides an unusual opportunity to get more in touch with myself. It makes me more intensely aware of my surroundings. I can actually feel my senses becoming keener to the point where I see things more fully than if I had been part of a group. What I especially like is not having to compromise on anything. I go where I want, when I want, at whatever pace I want. I eat when I'm hungry, I rest when I'm tired, and I don't have to appease, consult, or agree with anybody. My life is all mine for the duration. It may be selfish, but I like it. I don't feel guilty about it. There have been trips that I could have finished a day or two earlier, but I chose to stay on the fringe of civilization a little longer and not be tempted to reconnect by the lure of a hot shower or a fresh change of clothes or dinner that doesn't come pre-cooked in a foil bag. There's a difference between aloneness and loneliness. I have never been lonely when alone in the wild. Obviously, it's a risky business, but it makes you more resourceful and self-reliant, and these are benefits that you bring back home. Nevertheless, as much as I enjoy it, I have never advised anyone to go out alone. If you question whether it's a smart thing for you to do, it probably isn't. Which takes us now to fear. People say, have you ever been scared? So the short answer is yes. And the long answer is, damn right I've been scared. In fact, I've been scared so many times that I consider myself an expert on fear. If there was a PhD in fear, I'd be Dr. Scared. Things happen on any trip. But on this particular trip on Baffin Island, way back in 1989, it was just one of those things where every day something bad, something scary happened. I was out there by myself. The year that I went there, the ice never melted in the Baffin Bay, and there were a lot of polar bears around. And I was going to walk across. I had an Inuit family take me by boat across the bay to Baffin Island to the shore, and they told me, be careful of those polar bears. Once you get like 10 miles inland, you should be okay, because polar bears like seal, and so they don't want to go too far away from the coast. But those first 10 miles, you better be careful. Now I'm standing there with a can of bear spray, and I'm going, well, you know. So I start walking, and every 10 feet, I'm turning around, expecting to see a bear and hoping that I don't see it. You know, you just have that feeling that you're being stalked. And you could see, I mean, there was no trees or anything. It was, you know, I could see far back. And I knew that 30 seconds later when I turned around, there wasn't going to be anything there, but I couldn't help it. I was really scared. And I was saying, how long does it take to walk 10 miles? You know, I'll never get there. So I made it to 10, and then I was walking down the Owl River here, and I saw some mud, and I started walking through it, and I started to sink like in quicksand. And every time I try to pick my foot up, the other foot goes down deeper. And so I had to lunge off to the side and crawl out, got all muddy and whatnot. And I'm going, man, this is a scary place. Then a little while later, I had to cross this gorge here. This is an old rusty cable with a seat on it. And the idea was you sit in the seat and you pull yourself across. I'm going, no. No, don't make me do this. Now, if you had as few as 2 people, it wouldn't be that bad. One guy goes, gets in a chair, you pull the other guy across, you have one guy on each side, then each backpack, you put it in a chair, you shuttle it across, and then the last guy gets in the chair, he gets pulled across. But with only one person, you have to get in there with your pack at the same time. It's a lot heavier, and I didn't think that rusty cable was going to hold up. And I was so scared, I didn't know what to do. But I couldn't turn around and go back because I'd been dropped off by boat. There was no other way to do it. And so I tied my pack underneath the seat, and I got down. It was easy the first part because you're going down. But then the second part on the other side, just pulling. And it was rough. It was cold. It had started to snow. And I didn't know how the thing was going to end. But I'm here to tell you that I survived and really happy that I did that. And so fear I have something to say about that as well. Fear shows itself in different ways. In a crisis that requires an instinctive and immediate reaction, you don't have time to be afraid. Fear comes when it's over, when you think about how close you came to catastrophe. That was how I felt when I got stuck in that quicksand. I wasn't afraid at that time, but when I got out, my heart started pounding. Then there are times when fear messes with your mind, when you vividly imagine a frightful scenario that in reality doesn't exist. This was the deal with the polar bear. You know, that I was in no danger whatsoever, but I was scared out of my mind. The worst fear, however, is when it's right there in front of you and there's ample time to experience it, when it simmers until it threatens to overwhelm. I learned that one should never be afraid of being afraid. Fear is a part of life, and it can be a very healthy part, especially when you realize in a life-threatening situation, it's possible to rise above panic and maintain control of rampaging emotions. I understood what having courage really is, not the absence of fear, but the acceptance of it. And it's a good lesson to learn because you never get too old to get scared. Take my word for it. So there I am at the end of the trip, standing on the Arctic Circle there. I'm acting like I'm not scared, but by this time my nerves were totally shattered. But it was a good trip. So that brings us to number 10 and final, impact. People say, okay, what was the impact of all these years you've been doing it? What do you come away with? What did you learn? What is it all about for you? And if I had to really summarize it into one word, that word would be gratitude. I'm grateful that I had an opportunity to take these trips. I'm grateful that I went. I'm grateful for all the things that I saw, all the people that I met, all the stuff that I learned. I'm grateful that I'm still able to do it right now. So it's really all about gratitude. Whether it's 1966, when I'm up in the Yukon Territory with my little busted up Volkswagen, or 1980 here, the Raquette Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. Who goes canoeing in cowboy boots? It would be a New York dude, right? Glacier National Park, 1998. And this is Halti, the highest mountain in Finnish Lapland, 2006. And a couple of weeks ago, on my latest trip in the Dolomite Mountains in Italy, in every picture, I'm smiling. And I think it's really the smile of gratitude that I was able to do all this. And so I learned a lot. The first thing I learned was you got to stay curious. Curiosity, it just opens the door to knowledge and experience. Second thing I learned was to expand your comfort zone, to be willing to try something new, to put yourself in a different situation, to see how you react in places where you're just not used to dealing. Trusting your instincts, to believe in yourself, have courage of your convictions was another lesson I learned. Also to diversify, to not only do one thing. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but as much as I love trekking, I found it's important to me to also do something else, to have something else in my life. Because then when I go back to trekking, I kind of appreciate it more when I have something to compare it with. Finally, to keep my perspective, what I do is trek. I love to trek, but it's only trekking. I'm not finding a cure for cancer. I'm not bringing about world peace. I'm just a guy who puts one foot in front of the other to see where it takes me. And so I try to keep it in place to try to realize that there are other priorities that are bigger than this one thing that I love. And so I end this now by saying to you, keep going out there. I know you're all people who go into the outdoors. It's important, I think, that we try to get as many people out there as possible to really experience all the benefits, the physical, mental, emotional benefits that you get from being in the outdoors. If you go out there, try to take a kid with you so they can learn what it's like to be out there. And no matter how you go out there, just go out there. And so to paraphrase the words from a song from the greatest rock and roll band in history, the Grateful Dead, keep on trucking. And thank you very much.
If you enjoyed hearing JR's stories in this episode, be sure to pick up a copy of Way Out There at your local bookstore. Join the festivities and help us celebrate 50 years of adventure stories at the heart of the festival here in Banff. Check out our website at banffmountainfestival.ca. This episode was produced by Anique C. and is a production of Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. The theme music was composed by Jacques Blackstone. A special thanks to our audio engineer Ben Ewing and the production team at Banff Centre, as well as the folks from the Paul D. Fleck Library.